As many of my American viewers know, very shortly the United States is going to have an election. Yes, another election with numbers and statistics, percentage of vote won, who gets this office, who gets that office. Those things can be very interesting. I mean, look at Nate Silver, just a statistician, but he's followed very closely in the New York Times because people are interested in what the numbers actually bear out. Who are the American people voting for? That's part of being a Republican democracy. Perhaps no election, however, was more interesting than the election of 1860 for the President of the United States, won by, of course, Mr. Abraham Lincoln, considered to be one of the greatest presidents in the history of the United States. Abraham Lincoln, well, he was actually the second lowest popular vote getter in the history of the United States to become president. Only John Quincy Adams in 1828 won fewer of the popular votes. So how did this happen? How does a man only win 39.7% of the popular vote, which is what Abraham Lincoln got, and still become president of the United States? Well, as we know, before the Civil War, the United States was heavily split, and along a very distinct line, north and south. Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans were well aware of this, and so they understood what the Electoral College meant. Now, for those who don't know, the Electoral College is what actually determines the President of the United States, not the popular vote. Each state gives their Electoral College votes to the candidates based oftentimes on popular vote, not always in this era, as some did it through their legislatures, but that's how it often works. And so the Electoral College, which actually determines the president, was all you have to actually win. And, well, that means winning the more populous states, taking up those states that actually have population, since the Electoral College is based on your number of representatives and your number of senators. So Congress people is what determines the number of electoral votes for each state. So in modern parlance, take my home state of Nebraska. We have 3 people in the House of Representatives, 2 senators, therefore we have 5 Electoral College votes. It's not naturally states like Texas and California with large populations have many more Electoral College votes and therefore get more of the candidates' attention. Anyway, back to 1860. Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans knew all they had to do was win a majority of the Electoral College. And a majority of the Electoral College, enough to win the vote, was in the North. The northern part of the United States had enough votes in that regard, had enough of the population to actually completely win the presidency. Lincoln knew he was Republican and being anti-slave by nature as part of the platform, he could never win votes in the South. So all he had to do was win the North. So that's what him and his candidacy did. His presidential campaign moved forward, pushing to win just the North. Another very fortuitous thing happened at this time. The Democrats split into 2 parties. Yeah, there was the Southern Democrats and the more regular Democrats, I guess. Stephen Douglas was the traditional Democrats' man, and Stephen Douglas ran hard in the North and the South, thinking he was the person that could keep the Union together, campaign on this issue. The nation was vastly split by this time, though, and Douglas's efforts were mostly in vain. On the South, John Breckinridge, he ran for the South. He was the Southern man. He was the slave owner's man. And you know what? He won the South. He won almost all those electoral votes. But the problem was they weren't nearly enough to actually win the election. The South didn't have much of a population. They were rural and agrarian as opposed to more urban and heavily populated North. There was a 4th candidate in the race who actually won some Electoral College votes, and that was John Bell, who was sort of a wishy-washy constitutional Union Party, middle-of-the-road. We'll say the Union, it wasn't really much of a candidate in the states, kind of in the middle, voted for him. Tennessee, Kentucky, those who really didn't want to see the Union fall apart, who had favoritism towards the North and the South. Back to Lincoln, though. He understood, as the Republicans understood, all we have to really do is win those places that are heavily populated. New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, where Lincoln was from, Massachusetts. These places had large urban centers and a lot of population to drive up the votes. So that's where the Republicans concentrated. And that's what they did. So despite only winning 39.7% of the vote, they managed to win the whole presidential election. As for challengers in the North, Stephen Douglas was naturally the most obvious candidate, but he wasn't popular enough. Many people saw him as sort of a wishy-washy betrayer. They were angry with the South splitting away and running their own candidate, Breckinridge, and so Douglas suffered from some of that. And Douglas ran in the South as well, but often finished both behind Breckinridge and Bell, since Bell was somewhat Southern, being a Kentucky and Tennessee man, and really made no headway anywhere. The only state he really won was Missouri, a state that was firmly undecided about the whole Civil War that was coming thing. He also won an electoral vote or 2 in New Jersey, but really not much overall for Stephen Douglas, even though he was the 2nd most popular candidate in the race. That's right, he actually won the 2nd amount of the popular vote. he was second to Lincoln overall. But in terms of electoral college, he was actually last. So that's the difference that the college can make in determining the presidential election. You have to win states. Winning individual votes doesn't really do you any good. Now, there's been a popular rumor for years that if Breckinridge and Douglas had ran on one ticket, if they had kept the Democrats together, they could have beat Lincoln. That actually doesn't statistically bear out. If you count all their votes as one candidate, they still lose, and Lincoln still becomes president by a little bit slimmer margin, but he still gets in there. So that's it. The election of 1860. It's an interesting one that's all broken down by numbers, and one that was a cold, calculated political move by the Republicans to win the presidential election and take control of the nation and its political future. I guess you can see it for what it is, and Abraham Lincoln's considered one of the greatest presidents of all time. Slavery was abolished, which most people agree was a good thing. So maybe this cold, calculated political move, something that we usually deride here in the United States, was a good thing. Well, I hope that gives you just a little bit of historical perspective.